Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I'd like to bring you a very highly anticipated review, and that's of this little guy right here. The knife Spyderco now refers to as the Para3. The Para3 was something that's been being teased for about a year now. Spyderco announced that they were going to do a 3-inch version of one of their most popular knives, the Spyderco Para2. And, at one point it was called the Minuteman, but that got dropped for some reason, and now they finally released it, and here it is. It's the Para3. And the idea, the promise here is that they were going to make a smaller version of the PM2, and for people like me who love the PM2 but hate the size of it, well, that's a beautiful thing. So a lot of people have been on the lookout for this, and I'm just thrilled to have one and, to talk a little bit about it today. Let's do a size comparison because that's in many ways the most relevant feature of this knife. Next to your Para2 here, I'm going to call this the Para2 and this the Paramilitary 3. It's going to be a train wreck, but when I get through this together. But basically, you can see that the blade is smaller. They've cut off a fair amount of the tip from the Paramilitary 2 in the Para3. And if you put it in the pocket, you can see that these knives are fairly similar in size, except that the Para3, the PM2 there, has a much larger backside, if you will. There's a whole bunch of extra PM2 hanging off the back there relative to your Para3, and so that's something you really do have to keep in mind. In the pocket, the PM2 does carry a great deal bigger than the Para3. So that's something. Next one I want to pull in is the Spyderco Delica, and I'm going to do an explicit video, to answer all the question, should I buy a Delica or a Para3? It's a big question, but size-wise, the blades are just about the same in terms of overall length, although the Delica's got a little more flat going on here. And size in the pocket-wise, the Para3 is a little bit bigger than the Delica on every dimension. It's a little bit thicker in the pocket overall. And it's also a little bit larger. The blade goes a little higher. The backside of it sticks out a little further because of the lanyard tube, largely. But, they don't carry all that differently in the pocket, with one exception that we'll talk about a little bit later here. So, size-wise, these are very much in comparison, although the Para3 is undoubtedly bigger. And we can compare it, of course, to your Spyderco Dragonfly, which is a further step down. The Para3 is bigger than your Dragonfly, and especially in terms of the scales here. You can see that this is a much bigger knife in the pocket than your Dragonfly's ever going to be. And then, of course, for size comparison, here's an Ontario Rat number 2, which is right in the same ballpark in terms of blade length. And, of course, your Ontario Rat number 1. There we go. And because I happen to have one on the table, the Chris Reeve Knives Large Shabazz in Singo, which a lot of people know. So there you go. I'm going to do a couple of explicit comparison videos. Should I get a PM2? I'm sorry, should I get a Para3 or a Delica? Should I get a Sage 5 or a Para3? Etc. to address those issues. But now I just want to talk about this particular knife and talk about the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly. So let's get into it. So on the good side, first off, this is made in the US of A. It's at their Golden, Colorado, USA Earth Factory. This is beautiful if you live in the States for patriotic reasons. It's always nice to see knives made by the home team, so to speak. It's also beautiful for quality because the Golden Factory does very good work relative to, say, the Japanese factory, which is iffy, or the Chinese factory, which is also a little bit off. This is pretty damn good. Second only to the Taichung factory, and they're really doing a fundamentally different thing. So I love that this is a USA-made Spyderco for both of those reasons, quality as well as made in the USA too. Next thing, the steel on this guy is CPM S30V, which is a fine steel. That's the base steel for the regular Para2, and it's good. It's good to go. There's no trouble with S30V. It's going to be way better in some sprint run steels, but at the same time, it's fine as it is. Speaking of which, sprint runs. This is a Golden model. There are probably going to be sprint runs. They would be stupid to leave that money on the table, and so you're probably going to get one of these in like S110V. Or ideally, oh man, I would love to see one in M4 as a steel with the carbon fiber. That would bring me so much joy. So when I've already heard rumors that people are trying to do exclusive models of these guys, that's just going to be great. And so I'm really hoping that there's as thriving a scene for the Para3 sprint runs as there is for the PM2 already. It's a nice thing. Fit and finish on this guy is good. There's no real complaints with it. The Golden Factory does a good job by and large. They make a knife that's got a good action. I mean, it's as good as on the Para2, and that's just fine. Sure, it may not be an exact perfect showpiece. The machining isn't, oh my God, big. It doesn't need to be. It's a well put together knife, absolutely, with good tolerances and whatnot. There are also some nice improvements relative to the PM2. For instance, this little guy right here is a shouldered stop pin. This little stop pin is not screwed in anymore, so you got fewer screws to strip. And it does a nice job. The contouring on the handle is a little bit different. This guy, the Para2, has a little bit more contouring than the Para3. I'm sorry, the Para3's got more contouring than the Para2. And similarly, the angles in the hand are a little bit different. It's not just the case that they sawed off a PM2. It's clear that they thought this design through separately and differently. And so, overall, it's got some very nice little improvements. This guy also has a detent ball ramp, and I've heard some people say that PM2s have those already. I don't recall seeing them in some of the older PM2s I've handled. But either way, it's either brand new or it's great. But there were nice details here. And then you have the option for tip down or tip up carry on the right side or the left side. So you can move this clip to any of these 4 positions. That's always a beautiful thing. It's nice for lefties. The comp block is variably lefty friendly, but the positioning for the pocket clip is definitely so. And then finally, the size of this is great. Because 3 inches is a magic line for a lot of people. If you've got particularly scared legislators, you may have laws on the books saying nothing over 3 inches. And so no matter how much you like the PM2, it's simply not on the table. The other thing I'll say is that this looks a lot less murdery than the PM2 here. You bust this guy out in the lunchroom. It's not like the Spyderco military, which is a whole different affair. But if you bust this guy out in the lunchroom, you might get an odd glance. This guy attracts a little less attention. It feels like a smaller pocket knife. And so the size on this guy is really well chosen to come in at the 3-inch line. And it carries nicer too, so the size on this is very, very good. So that's what's good here. The size, the fact that you get the 4 carry options, some nice improvements, good fit and finish. There are gonna be sprint runs. There better be sprint runs. The steel is good, and it's made in the USA. All that is just good. Let's talk about what's great. Really, what's great here is that they didn't screw up what made the PM2 so wonderful. The Spyderco PM2 is an incredible and smart knife design. It's incredibly intelligent. There is not that much negative I can say about the PM2 aside from its size, and we'll get there. But it has great action, and so does the Para3. They've kept that around. With the compression lock, that's a beautiful thing. And the compression lock itself is a beautiful thing. It's a strong locking mechanism. It's like a liner lock in that you pop this over, and the little tab puts into that space, and so in order to shut the knife accidentally, you actually would need to compress a little sheet of metal, and that's not doing particularly easily. So that's the compression lock itself is a beautiful thing. Similarly, the ergonomics on this guy are very, very nice. There's one hot spot on the clip, and we'll talk about that later, but by and large, the ergos on the PM2 were really good too, so they kept that around. The durability is still good. It's still got full steel liners, so I don't feel like this is a meaningfully weaker knife than the PM2. And it's still a great cutting tool because they've still got a relatively high blade with a relatively flat grind. I mean, so it's a great knife. And so basically, they've made a knife that is just as great as the PM2 because it keeps all those great attributes. And they fixed the biggest issue with it, which is the fact that the PM2 is just too damn big. And so in doing this, they've managed to turn something that is incredible into something that is incredible and slightly smaller. And I was very, very scared that they were going to screw it up in some serious way that would completely take this guy off the table. But no, they've done something great, which is to do something great a little bit smaller. So that's what's great. It's just as good as a PM2, but a little smaller. Let's talk about what's bad here. Okay, so on the bad side, first off, a lot of people are concerned that the price on this guy is actually the same as the base model PM2. So this is a sprint run up here, so it's more expensive, but a base PM2 has the S30V and the black G10, and it runs about 120 bucks, and this guy runs about 120 bucks. Thing is, honestly, that doesn't bother me particularly because I think it's still a very nice price for this knife. It's got good materials, it's good steel, it's well built, and it is a great knife overall. And so the fact that, yes, you can get slightly more knife in terms of materials for the same price if you buy a PM2 doesn't strike me as out of line. They're going to sell a lot more PM2s, so economy of scale, and they've sold them for years and years and years. To get some, they're recouping the costs of R&D. That just doesn't bug me. The price is fine. Some people are going to disagree, but that's okay. I think it's just okay. No problem. There is still no sharpening choil on this. That is one thing that a lot of people have asked for. The position of the glesses, I gather, is that if you're cutting into something, it's very easy to get hung up on that sharpening choil. A sharpening choil looks a little something like this here, where you've got a little cutout, so you can sharpen the entire length of the blade. Size comparison with your big and murdery ZT452 here. The PM2 didn't have one, and neither does the Para3. It's not the end of the world, but it is something I'd like to see, especially when you've got this very sharp plunge grind here. It makes it a little tricky to get all the way to the edge there with your stones. Not a huge deal, though. And then finally, this is still very thick in the pocket relative to some of your other options. This is thicker than your Delica. It's the same thickness as your Para2. And, you know, that's a little bit on the thick side. It's not the end of the world. This is very easy to pocket. And there are knives that are way, way thicker. I mean, this is a Cricket Razor here. Holy crap, is that thicker. Or, well, you know, maybe a Medford here, where the blade is about the thickness of the Para3 here. But nonetheless, I'd hope they might be able to slim it down a little bit. But it's not the end of the world. The biggest issue with the PM2 was the bulk of the handle, and they knocked that down. So that's what I got on the bad side. The price is the same as the PM2. Sure, I'd like to see it cheaper, but I'm okay with it as it is. There's still no sharpening choil, and it's still pretty thick in the pocket. But again, not a huge deal. There are some huge deals, though, so let's talk about the ugly. So on the ugly front, there are two issues here. The first one is actually kind of a cascade of issues. The big one is that they're using the wrong size lanyard tube, in my opinion. They're reusing the same size lanyard tube as on the PM2. I'm sure that that's saving them some money, absolutely, but it's just too big for this knife, both visually speaking, and you can see that it takes up a lot of your handle here. If we overlay the Delica and the Para3 here, you can actually see that a lot of the area where the Para3 is bigger is just holding this damn huge lanyard tube. And that just makes this knife way bigger than it needs to be. But more importantly, you can carry this knife tip down. That's not ideal because of this nice thick hump here. It makes a bunch of mass right at the top of your pocket to get by. But if you go tip up, which is how I prefer to carry it, this is a very shallow carry knife. You can see here that the pocket clip, the knife extends about this far out of your pocket when it's clipped in there because this lanyard tube is way, way up there. Compare that to the PM2 here, which only extends up about that high. That's a lot smaller, and it makes for a much more, frankly, ergonomic sort of carry situation, and, you know, makes the Delica seem positively shallow, deep in its carry, and compared to a knife that has an actual deep carry clip, like, for instance, your ZT452CF here, the Para3 is sticking way the heck out of there. Practically speaking, it didn't bother me so much because the top of the knife is still relatively thin. I still carried this fine, but that's really disappointing that this has to carry so shallow at the expense of a damn lanyard tube. Who needs those anyways? I know that's controversial. But anyways, the bigger issue from that, though, is that because this clip is so low, the clip is low on the handle itself, and this ramp right here ends up riding into my hand in an unpleasant way. If I'm really gripping on this guy, this little ramp is digging right into my hand right here. I got smaller hands than some. Maybe some people aren't going to struggle with this. But the fact that you've got this prominence right at that important area in your hand makes this a much less ergonomic knife than it could have otherwise been. This knife without a clip feels great in the hand. This knife with the clip in this position is less than ideal. I'm a little afraid that if I would have put a deep carry clip on there, and rest assured I'm going to be trying that, that it's going to be also ergonomically problematic because the deep carry clip's bulk is going to be right here at this end interface. But it may feel a little bit better than having this ramp right there. But anyways, those those three issues, the huge lanyard, the shallow carry, and then the hot spot that this clip creates, kind of, it's just unfortunate and a little bit sad. They could have done the lanyard just by having a little post here. They could have used the smaller lanyard tube. Maybe they could have not put a lanyard tube on there at all. Just thinking out loud there. Not every knife needs a lanyard. But, again, controversial, I know. But those three things together are pretty ugly. That shallowness, I'm not in love with. I still carry it. I don't hate it, but it's still ugly. The other thing that's very ugly about this knife, and that I do outright hate, is the red Loctite. I mentioned this in my disassembly video, but they're using a permanent thread locker on this guy. Both of these screws were slathered in a permanent thread locker that even for me, I disassemble a lot of knives, made this knife really hard to get apart, and even this screw started to strip out. And, the red Loctite could be okay if they were using very hard screws, but unfortunately, in my experience, the USA-made Spyderco screws strip like you're throwing 20s at them. And that's ugly because, unfortunately, if you've got permanent Loctite, so you're having to heat the knife up in order to get it to turn at all, and you've got screws that are likely to strip, a lot of people are going to end up taking their knives apart, which voids the warranty. That's separately ugly. And then ending up with a knife they can't put back together because the screws have stripped out. Given the fact that Spyderco doesn't sell the screws either, that's terrible. So the red Loctite thing is bad, and they need to stop doing it. This was just made in golden. There's a thread right now on the Spyderco forums called Red Loctite, and Spyderco officially has been deafeningly silent in this thread. They have said nothing about it. And that's weird to me. I keep hoping they're going to go in there and say, oh yeah, sorry, we ran out of the regular thread locker, so we had to use that for a little while. Okay, I can live with that, but they need a good explanation as to why they're really hurting their knives in this way and hurting their enthusiasts in this way. You gotta maintain your knife, and that just makes it hard, and it makes it dangerous and easy to damage a knife when it doesn't need to be. So that's the ugly here. This red Loctite combined with these really strippy screws is nasty, and then the lanyard tube with the accompanying shallow carry and hot spot, that's ugly too. So those are the uglies. But let's go into the final conclusion, because it's not all doom and gloom. My final conclusion is actually expressed rather nicely in this flowchart right here. It'll give you a series of questions you gotta ask yourself about this knife that'll help you out a little bit. The big one is, have you ever handled a PM2? Did you like the PM2? If you didn't like the PM2, well, that puts you over here. If you didn't like the PM2 because it's freaking huge, well then you should be considering the Para. But if you didn't like the PM2 because of some aspect of its essential nature, you don't like the compression lock, you don't like the ergonomics, you don't like the blade shape, you don't like some other variety of it, chances are you're not going to like the Para3 either, and you probably shouldn't buy one. If you hate the PM2 because of what the PM2 is, in any way that isn't size related, this isn't going to satisfy you either. This is very, very similar to the PM2, just smaller. That said, if you do like the PM2, or if you're not sure, the big question you gotta ask then is tip up or tip down carry. If you're a big fan of tip down carry, where it hangs in your pocket like this, then buy a Para3. Absolutely 100%, there's just no question. It is spectacular as a tip-down carry knife. If you like tip-up carry, the bigger question becomes, are you okay with this shallow carry issue that I described to you? Or are you willing to do an aftermarket clip? If you're okay with the shallow carry clip, then I think you should still look at the Para3. I think there's still enough good here, absolutely, to consider doing that. But if that shallow carry thing's going to bug you, you're probably going to want to dodge it. So that's kind of where it comes down to, is those three questions. If you like the PM2 and you like tip down, do it. Or if you're okay with shallow carry, do it. But if you don't like the PM2, you're probably not going to like the Para3. So I guess a different way of putting that, more generally speaking, is that if you are looking for a really great everyday carry knife, and you want something that's small but also relatively burly, maybe a little bit more burly than your Spyderco Delica, which is a knife that's plenty capable, but it's not quite as capable as this guy, this is one of the very best choices out there. My video about what's the very best everyday carry pocket knife could very easily feature this guy as an option, along with something like the Sage 5 and the Delica and the 940 and the PM2. I am really hoping that they address this lanyard hole issue in the Para 3.1, or whatever they call the next revision of this. I hope they make it a little smaller, or just do away with it altogether and move these holes up here. And I also hope that they move to a less serious thread lock to just ASAP, because there's no excuse for that. But the thing is, even as it is, even with this little issue, it is still a spectacularly done knife. It is still wonderfully designed. It's an intelligent design, and honestly, it's great. This is a great knife, absolutely. And so for me, this is pretty uncontroversially a gem. They have taken everything that makes the PM2 great, and they just made it a little bit smaller. So if you want a smaller PM2, you've got one. And a couple of issues aside, that they've done a stellar job with it. So, yeah, that's the final conclusion. Follow the flowchart or just pick one up. It's really, really nice. And with a couple of tweaks, it could be absolutely top of the game. And it's pretty close, even as it is. So, there you go. I hope this has been interesting to you. And mostly, I hope that you have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye, everybody.